Hello everyone, this is Poetry Podcast number 6, the sequel. This is Titus Felix recording in Bucharest with my friend Felix. How about you introduce yourself, Felix, and give us the day's business? What are we doing?
Hello people. Last time we went through a poem by Ezra Pound, The Study in Aesthetics. We went through it as closely as we could, reading through the images that Pound showed us and his very unusual conclusion. And today we're going to try and look at the thing as a whole and see what we can harvest, what we can reap from last time's sowing. See exactly.
Yeah, we want to see how it is that this deals with poetry and how poetry deals with aesthetics. What is it that Ezra Pound can offer you here as opposed to some kind of professor in a university or indeed any other thing that deals with beauty except poetry? But before we get to that, let's have a reading of the poem again.
Sure. The Study in Aesthetics. The very small children, in patched clothing, being smitten with an unusual wisdom, stopped in their play as she passed them and cried up from their cobbles, "Guarda! Ay, guarda, che bea!" But 3 years after this, I heard the young Dante, whose last name I do not know, for there are in Sirmione 28 young Dantes and 34 Catuli, and there had been a great catch of sardines, and his elders were packing them in the great wooden boxes for the market in Brescia, and he leapt about, snatching at the bright fish and getting in both of their ways, and in vain they commanded him to sta fermo, and when they would not let him arrange the fish in the boxes, he stroked those which were already arranged, murmuring for his own satisfaction this identical phrase, "Che bea." And at this I was mildly abashed.
And this is our starting point today. We went through the poem previously, but we stopped at this conclusion. The poem is structured into 2 unequal parts that give you 2 brief scenes. They're supposed to make some kind of story in temporal succession, but you get the experience of the beautiful first in very small children, then in the young Dante. And then you get this conclusion, and at this I was mildly abashed. This is one of very few comments made by the poet directly to us, the audience, and in some way this is supposed to help us understand what is so complicated about the experience of the beautiful, why it is that this is tied up with poetry and aesthetics, how could this be any kind of study as opposed to just giving you these 2 stories for the very small children and the young Dante and leaving it at that. The stories are somewhat entertaining, but they are not obvious, they're not explicitly about bashfulness. The conclusion introduces this. And at this I was mildly abashed. This is somehow supposed to explain how we should reread the poem. With this kind of conclusion in mind, no bashfulness mentioned before, we have to reread and to try to think through again, how does this come up to form a whole? How is this going to lead us anywhere? So Felix, what do you think? Is there any kind of talk about bashfulness in the first image concerning the very small children?
There's no talk of it. There's a hint towards shame, in the sense that we know children to speak shamelessly sometimes. And we see them do that here. But as we mentioned before, it's not something that we reprimand. It's not a situation where we try to enforce shame. It's a situation where we can live with shame. We can accept the shameless. In the second part, again, there's no mention directly, but you have, I think, this occurrence, this intercession, saccholide, where he brings in 2 poets, Catullus and Dante. I think this would, if explored a little, bring up the topic of shame. As we mentioned, because Catullus wrote very shameless poetry, and a lot of it is pretty shameless on seduction and on persuading women or persuading men, for that matter, to give in to temptation, to give in to something beautiful. Dante also has in the comedy, there's a central part in the cantos, the purgatory cantos. He reaches the earthly paradise and Beatrice comes, and there's a very big discussion on shame there. Beatrice scolds Dante quite violently. At one point, she's so serious about it that she stops some angels from singing, and she interrupts them and tells them to shut up, and turns back to Dante and again has him repent for certain sins of his youth. Now, those sins of the youth had to do with the fact that Beatrice died close to the middle of her life, and by degrees Dante is said to no longer have loved the good that he had loved in loving beautiful Beatrice. The situation there is that Dante has to say it himself, that he was fooled by appearances, which are mentioned as fleshly appearances, that seduced him and turned him away from a superior kind of poetry. A poetry for which Beatrice herself would have been the muse, but he turned away from her after her passing, after her turning immortal. So there aren't specific mentions, there's no description of shame or of the experience of shame, but the young Dante would repent for some of his youthful sins. This would emerge if you think about Dante, and even in this context.
So we've got here 3 different levels at which we need to think about the poem. First of all, there's the 2 scenes, the 2 little stories we are offered. Shame there is something that we might think about with our adult knowledge of the world, but which is not obvious to either the very small children or the young Dante. They are somehow too young for shame. Shame is a human thing, but it is apparently an adult thing. As you said, it would have to be enforced. Children have to be taught propriety. They themselves do not know it. It does not emerge spontaneously, apparently. That somehow is tied up with becoming an adult. This brings us to the second level. At this level, what we're given in the story, very small children, 3 years later they're not very small. Now we're concerned with the young Dante. Anonymity turns into a protagonist, a man with a name. Young Dante's name recalls Dante, and as you pointed out, recalls the youth of Dante and the peculiarities and problems it caused. This is a kind of portrait of the artist as a young man. Shame here emerges as the defining experience of young love. Young love is somehow caught up with shame. It is both innocent and otherwise. We'll have to look at how this emerges in the story, why it is that the poet feels the need to tell us what we apparently would not have seen otherwise, that this whole process of growth, of becoming a young Dante, is tied up with coming to learn about shame. And then there's a third level, as you mentioned. This has to do with writing poetry. Both Catullus and Dante are incredibly famous poets. They were very influential in their age, and they have to some extent earned the peculiar immortality of poets. Apparently people name their children for them, and also read their poetry at least sometime. This is a teaching for poets specific, how they should think about their art, how they should think about writing, and how they should think about their audience, what the opportunities are and what the dangers are of the experience of the beautiful and the speeches about the beautiful. And we're going to try and go through these 3 levels one by one. So first, we have the absence of shame in situations which call for it. In the first image, very small children cry, "This is beautiful," about a woman passing by. This is the shamelessness of innocence. They say what they see. This is called an unusual wisdom. To be able to say what is in front of you is apparently only spontaneously given to children. The humor we find in the shamelessness of children has to do with the fact that they say things we would not dare to say because it is improper. In the second scene, we have a somewhat different situation. In this case, young Dante wants to do something shameful rather than says something shameful. What he does is snatch at fish. When we were talking about this before, you told me that this somehow has to do with the problem of possession and propriety and property, that the fish do not belong to him. They are not his to do with as he wants, as he pleases. They are not there for his desire.
Yeah, you don't get the beginning of the story where he was coming down the docks, he saw the great catch, and he was smitten with the image of the great catch in the nets and got involved in boxing things. You don't get that. You see him immediately in the middle of what he wants to do. He is not beholding anything. What he's basically interested in is in getting, in having, and he's not too gentle about it.
Indeed, no. He's leaping about, he's snatching at fish, not in control of himself, and his elders are trying to get in control of him. For the one time in the poem, you see an order being shouted. Stand still, stop moving. One thing that's remarkable here is that young Dante is himself speechless, and the speech of his elders is about going on in speechlessness. At this level, we wouldn't have any kind of study about aesthetics, about the beautiful and how it concerns us in poetry. We have to think about this situation, why it is that these people are not speaking, and what is there to say about these very banal scenes. Kids playing in the streets, adults doing what is proper to them, which is not play but work. You notice certain things here that you might speak about if you read the poem. For example, that the proper work of children is play and of adults work, and that what the adults do, unlike the children, is install order. Out of the chaos of a catch of sardines, a great catch, they are creating the order of placing them in boxes. It's not clear that there's no interest in this order. The interest of young Dante is in the bright fish, but he moves from snatching at them chaotically to stroking the fish already arranged in boxes, and we are told that that was his desire, to arrange the fish. This is proper to children. They imitate adults. He wants to imitate his elders. But it also brings out this connection between the beauty of the fish and the beauty of the way they are ordered and classified. Poetry has some kind of order. Pound ordered his own poem in two different scenes and a conclusion. And both scenes end with the same phrase, "This is beautiful," and we are told it's this identical phrase, "Québert." The poet attracts our attention to the order of his beautiful poem, just like he attracts our attention to the order in the arrangement of the fish that the elders do. The poet, therefore, is both in the situation of young Dante, who wants to grab at beautiful things, and in the situation of the elders, who do work, who have a craft, and the craft of poetry, just like the craft of packing fish, implies making order where there was none before. In a certain sense, young Dante is, like his elders, a fisherman, but the fish he's trying to catch has already been caught. Why is he trying to do that? Well, it's a nice joke about poetry. The poet also is trying to catch things that have already been caught. He tells you stories about what people do. The deeds have already been done. Now we only have speeches about those deeds. This is how he moves from the order that you see in front of you to the order that you have to make of your own experience. This is why it's so important that we get a speech that is simply shouted out in surprise by the very small children, and another speech heard apparently only by the poet, a murmur, something private, not public, something secret. And yet the same thing is said both times. This is beautiful. But now the beautiful has caught on some other quality that was not at all obvious before, and the poet tells us directly. At that speech, he was mildly abashed. This is why we have to ask ourselves, why does the poet tell us this? Why are we given a speech about how beauty is tied up with shame?
So the question that I keep asking is, just like I was thinking about, what does it mean to murmur something to yourself? That it means that you want to reinforce, you want to emphasize, if for no one else but yourself, something that you know. You don't want to lose grasp of it. At this point, he's not allowed to snatch the fish anymore. He's going to become harmless to whatever work needs to be done. He's not going to jeopardize it anymore. And the experience for him changes. The fact that the elders intervened allowed for him to remove himself a little from getting the fish. Stroking them also allows, to an extent, if he's still too close or he's closer, he's still in a position, now he's in a position to look at them. He's gentler. Just like I was asking about what does it mean that he murmurs it to himself, he wants to reinforce it. It seems like the same question is important, is what does it mean to be mildly abashed at something? I say that I saw this thing on the street, or I heard this thing being said, and I was a little ashamed myself. The poet didn't go through any of these situations. He's not the one leaping about for fish, but he feels in a sense as if he is like that. That's what we mean when we say that, I was a little ashamed when I heard that. We tend to be ashamed at something when we realize that there's something true, and as you pointed out on our previous discussion, It's not just any kind of truth that abashes us. It's not some mathematical truth. It's something that's true about ourselves and our experience or our past. I thought that this is the conclusion that you're being given, that if you examine the experience of the young Dante, or as the poet examines the experience of the young Dante and offers it to you, he also feels the need to say that in a sense he is close to the young Dante, or had been at one point in the past close to the young Dante. He can sympathize with that. He has felt the same, or not felt the same as much as undergone the same transition or change. From one type of beauty to another, one which is very much possessed or directed towards possessing, to a gentler kind of beholding as a more mature human being, not as a child. You're not just stunned. There's a new experience in front of the beautiful, which requires shame, or it requires some kind of order to appear or to happen, because young people are just too reckless, or they're just too enthusiastic.
Yes, so this is something that we have to think about. In what way is the youthful experience of beauty excessive, immoderate, and in what way does poetry help to moderate? The young Dante is immature. He puts himself in a situation where elders, authority figures, tell him to stop what he's doing. What he's doing is improper, even though he doesn't know it. This is how he learns that what he's doing is improper. He has recourse to something else instead, to murmurs. Speeches are going to give you a sense of his experience when he cannot fulfill his experience as he had previously wanted. Shame here seems like a barrier in front of what you want to do, and you have to understand why that is, that there is such a thing as a barrier. Why is there such a thing as shame, in order to figure out what you should be doing. The experience of the beautiful is changed when once we learn about shame, because it introduces the complication of desire. Very small children are simply stunned by beauty. They have no desire to hold. They are satisfied with beholding. This is not the case with the young Dante. He spontaneously wants to hold the beautiful things he sees. Possession becomes a problem, and he grasps at beautiful things. In some sense, this kind of shameless grasping is necessary for poetry, in the sense that you have to grasp at the meaning that the poet has given to his stories. You have to try to understand what he's thinking. In another sense, it is like the shamelessness of the very small children. You have to say what you see. You have to tell the truth, even if the truth is shameful. Some part of the truth about who we are as human beings apparently is shameful. How do we deal with that? One obvious thing that the poet is teaching us here is that the poet does it by speaking two different kinds of speeches. Some things he says publicly, like the very small children crying out. Some things he says privately, like the young Dante murmuring. And indeed, he has got to sympathize with the situation of the young man who discovers the complications with beauty and desire. What is so different between youth, young Dante, and childhood, the very small children, is that the youth is erotic. His actions show that. That is what is mildly abashing. It's funny to think that the poet is not all that abashed. He's certainly not so bashful that he won't say it. But there is something to be said for the connection between beauty, desire, and shame. Trying to reason about that seems to be what poetry is supposed to be doing, if this is indeed, as the poet tells us, the study in aesthetics. It would seem like the first scene with the very small children is simply insufficient. You cannot leave it at saying, the very small children in patched clothing, being smitten with an unusual wisdom, stopped in their play as she passed them and cried up from their cobbles, guarda, che bea! Why can't that be the poem? It's too simple. It does not introduce the complicating factor of desire. With the young Dante, 3 years later when he's grown up, he's not a very small child now, with him you get this complexity when you want to possess that which you find beautiful and therefore desirable. This is important to poetry for a very simple reason. If people don't like your poems, they're not going to read them, you're not going to be famous, nobody's going to care about what you have to say. But if they like them, then they want to get something out of them. They get the pleasure, certainly. You read poems, they might sound good, they might tell you something that interests you. You get some kind of pleasure out of that. But there is something more to be said. There is this complexity, the contradiction between private and public speaking, the contrary motions or powers of beauty. Beauty can paralyze you. Beauty can also attract you. It has this power to move you, and you have to get some sense of what it is and why it does that to you so that you can know yourself. The poet is interested in these experiences of youth, coming to learn about eroticism and about beauty because they have a power to move people. This power is somehow the specifically human thing, the thing that you're supposed to notice when you compare very small children and young people and their elders, and presumably somewhere between youth and old age, there is the poet himself. He underwent this process and he's trying to educate others about it. So there is a kind of subtle political teaching here that goes together with the teaching about the kinds of speeches about beauty and their effects on people. The elders simply give orders. They are the authority figures and they speak in the imperative. Stand still. Stop doing what you want to do. Desire and order are opposed here. The poet is trying to put them together in a way. His speech is supposed to be ordered, but at the same time to deal with the desires of young people. He does not disagree with the elders that there is something improper in the way in which young Dante is dealing with the fish who are so bright and attractive. But he does not disagree with Dante that they are bright and attractive, which seems to be completely invisible to his elders. The work of poetry in this case would be to put together the laws by which the elders try to rule the youth and the desires of the youth, which have got to get some kind of satisfaction. It seems like the study in aesthetics requires that we come to understand that in some way. As I said, there are two basic ways of understanding what it is that we do with reading poems. Sometimes they're just fun or pleasing in some way, but other times we feel like they might be important, like we may be on to something that really matters to us, that we could get something aside from the pleasure, and that would be self-knowledge. What young Dante is lacking is self-knowledge. He is mute, dumb, speechless, just leaping at the fishes like children might do. He has got to change in some way. He has got to say to himself, if he can't speak with anybody else, he's got to say to himself, this is beautiful, so that he knows that it is important and that his feelings about it really matter, to him at least, if not to his elders or anybody else, because otherwise he'll never get to take himself seriously, as opposed to, say, taking the job seriously of fishing and making money out of fish. That's somewhat important, the elders are doing it, but what is important to the youth is something else. That is what the poet is concerning himself with, what he wants or thinks he's capable of doing. And so the experience of the beautiful is the way the poet learned and teaches us what it is to grow up and be an adult in a certain way, in the way that is connected with self-knowledge specifically. Very small children only say what they see and think nothing about it. The young Dante is a more complex being, but he doesn't even speak if he doesn't have to. He is forced to speak because he is ordered not to do what he wants to do. He doesn't reflect either. Reflection comes in a more complicated way, and apparently it is tied up with poetry. At least we need these kinds of poems to help us think through it.
I guess the conclusion, in a sense, brings this out, that if you want to get at something that contributes to self-knowledge, you can't just examine beautiful things. You also need to put them together with the way human beings react to beautiful things. It's true that he says that he is mildly abashed, and that this might mean that he went through a similar process like the young Dante's. But on the other hand, like you said, that you could just have the poem stop on the first stanza. Why have that one? Why not just have the second stanza end with a conclusion, and at this I was mildly abashed, and leave it at that? Why do you need the first instance? What is it in the way people talk about children who wonder at things, and about children who innocently become in awe of something, the way they react? Those are still things that we find important, about the ability to enjoy beautiful things. Elders are just immune to this, utterly immune. They don't find the young Dante interesting either. They don't find the fish interesting. what I'm reaching for is that this conclusion is supposed to put those two images and the experience as well as the experience of other people as well as our experience of the beautiful together. Because otherwise you wouldn't get to know if you didn't empathize with others, if you didn't see others in a position where they are smitten. Even the poet himself, if he was at one point smitten, it's not clear. If he was like the young children once, it's not clear that he would have thought about things had he not been in the position of young Dante as well. You need an exploration of these two scenes. You can't have one without the other, because otherwise you can't come to the conclusion that human beings grow up. From children, they grow up, and you need order or shame to be able to have some kind of self-knowledge. Otherwise, it never gets to that. You'd be like a child, always erratic in the face of beauty. It's not just that it's not proper, it's that maybe it's also impious.
Yeah, the very small children are smitten as though they were punished in some comic way. People are supposed to be people. If they're not that way, they have to be made that way. And in that sense, self-knowledge is tied up with the poet's claim that he apparently knows all ages of men. Very small children, young people, adults like the poet, elders, they all come within his compass, and he has got to put that experience into a kind of human whole in order to claim that he has self-knowledge and therefore could do better to teach young Dante than, say, his elders. It's quite a proud statement if you think about it, that the study in aesthetics has to do with knowing the human beings, and that knowing them in relation to beauty is knowing who they really are. The elders who are presented as immune to beauty would simply not even take that seriously. The poet needs to retrieve the spontaneous or natural experience of the beautiful in children and the erotic experience in young Dante to be able to make a claim that he can do what the elders are trying to do, to get young Dante to do what he's supposed to do. And he's going to do it by pleasure, not by orders or
by work.
Yeah.
There is a defense of what the young Dante does with it. He does not declare what young Dante does as wholly impious or entirely shameful. It has to be qualified because there's something needful there, because life with simply work or life as work wouldn't make any sense anymore. It wouldn't be anything to talk about, it wouldn't be anything beautiful. It's not emphasized, but there is a small defense in the conclusion of what young Dante goes through, both in the sense that the poet suggests he agrees he has gone through it. He's gone through that, and he recommends to an extent the change and the turn young Dante goes through.
Yeah, there's this opposition between work and something that isn't work, which has got to be maintained rather than solved. People working for a living or making a living out of something means getting what is good for them. The poet wants to add to that what is lost if we focus on it, which is to say the beauty and the power of beauty to attract us, to move us, to get us to do stuff. Beauty moves us in the direction of what we think is good for us, actually. Somehow the beautiful announces the good. The very small children are already aware, by this unusual wisdom tied up with beauty, about women. Young Dante is already aware of, in this case, the job that his elders do, because the fish are beautiful. And somehow the phenomenon has got to be retrieved and preserved. You cannot ask people to throw away concern with the beautiful, or try to get rid of poetry altogether, try to just get rid of people who make pretty speeches. To get rid of that would mean to get rid of education, apparently.
Yeah, there's a lot that you can just probe through in the conclusion as it reflects on the first two images. This brings out, not sure if it's a teaching exactly, but it brings out some certain cautionary remarks. This is a study in aesthetics, but as you said, it doesn't sound like a treatise. It's not supposed to be a treatise. It's a different form of lesson, or it's a different form of teaching. And I'm not sure why it is that at the end it has to be. I mean, it's poetry, I understand that, but there's still a lot that's left uncertain at the end. Is this all there is to the study of aesthetics? Is there something else? Is this just the essential part, or?
Well, it's the first part. He explicitly gives you the experience of the beauty in objects, in people, as it first emerges. He wants you to see how we even become aware of the beautiful and how important that is for us to be educated. It's not all of the study in aesthetics or all of aesthetics, but it shows you the origin, and maybe that is the most important part.
Yeah.
Maybe that's, in some sense, an origin we can never get beyond. We are, even as adults, able to be struck by beauty and either to be attracted to get beautiful things or to be arrested in our emotions and just to stare. Exactly, and even forget what we're about and that we're adults, just stare at something beautiful. This is not something that goes away. It seems like the poet suggests that we have to put together in some way youth and age. There's something very artful about the poem. The most obvious thing is this very comical inversion of experiences and objects. You would expect children to be playing with fishes and young men to be chasing after women. The way he reverses these things has everything to do with drawing out the origin of eroticism in the beautiful. He's trying to clarify something that in our typical experiences is not clear. That does show not only a real concern with education, but serious knowledge about what people's experiences really are. So in that way, just beginning the study in aesthetics is all of the study in aesthetics, and it's up to us to keep it up. I think that's pretty remarkable that we can get this out of a poem and think through our experiences and what we think we know about people in a clearer way, in a way that tries to make sense of who we are. It somehow puts together what we know about other people and what we think we know about ourselves. That seems to be the unifying claim of poetry as an education. It's an education for the whole man.
Yep, okay.
So I think we're done here. Thanks everybody for listening. It's been really interesting to go along with you through this poem and through its very daring conclusion. We hope to show you that reading and then rereading can help bring out a very interesting teaching and insights into who we are. Join us next time. We'll be talking some more about Ezra Pound. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.